Welcome back to our series about exploring the meaning of Christian identity by exploring the sojourning history of Israel. In the last section, we looked at the experience of Israel in Egypt and how these experiences awakened Israel to the importance of upholding cosmic justice and harmony. In this section, we will look at the consequences of Israel's failure in doing this and how it led to Israel's continued reformation in Babylon. Now, the time span between the Babylonian captivity and the Exodus is a little less than 1,000 years. This is because some people believe that the Exodus occurred in the 1200s BC, while other people believe it occurred in the 1400s BC, while the Babylonian captivity occurred in the 500s BC. So that's why it's about a little less than 1,000 years in between. And between that time, we have the book of Joshua, which covers Israel coming into Canaan, and we have the Judges up to the stories of David and Saul and the establishment of the kingdom of Israel, followed by the building of the temple and Solomon and the eventual fracturing of the kingdom of Israel into the northern kingdom, which consists of 10 of the tribes, and the southern kingdom, which is reorganized into the kingdom of Judah, which has the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And during this time, we have the prophets coming onto the scene. And the prophets are more or less, they are warning the kings and condemning them for their apostasy to gods like Baal and their oppression of the poor. And it is for these reasons, of these instances of corruption, that Israel is eventually allowed to be conquered by nations like Assyria and Babylon. And these nations, after conquering Israel, they remove a portion of the population and deports them into Mesopotamia. And as stated earlier in the previous section, when Israel was deported into captivity among the nations, only the elite members of society were actually taken. The scholar George Barton states that it is often popularly supposed that at the time of the Babylonian exile, Israel's life was completely broken off, and that the whole population was transported en masse to Babylonia. Such certainly was not the case. Nebuchadnezzar made two deportations of the higher officials, the priests and the more wealthy citizens. This would mean that the majority of the population would have been left behind. In fact, scholar Richard Gottow notes how only about one-fourth of the population, according to 2 Kings, or perhaps more correctly, one-eighth, according to Jeremiah, was led captive into Babylonia. This is because in order to control a population in ancient times, one only had to remove the cultural elite and replace them with one's own, since the mass of peasants would just simply follow whoever was in charge. Thus, ancient expulsions were almost always expulsions of elite members, not entire populations. Because Israel failed to uphold justice in the land vomited them out just as it did the Canaanite kings. Indeed, the Deuteronomic history seems to consistently blame kings and elite members of society for these downturns, mostly because they were the ones who had the power to implement social change the most. Because the nobility settled down to adopt a farmer mindset, God saw it fit to humble them by sending them back out into the liminal marginalization of diaspora to relearn the shepherd spirit of their ancestors. However, their experience in diaspora was not like the slavery of their ancestors in Egypt. The exiles were free to live as regular citizens of Babylon. Gottow notes how they were permitted to till the soil, to cultivate the family life, and, by thrift and diligence, to accumulate wealth. Perhaps they were allowed the undisturbed exercise of their religion, and nowhere are bloody persecutions heard of, designed to alienate forcibly the people from their ancestral religion, and to coerce them into accepting that of the conquerors. Be this as it may, the Israelites still felt their marginality, by virtue of being foreigners in a foreign land, forcibly removed far away from their homes. They also would have been suffering heavily from a crisis of faith and identity. After all, they were supposed to be God's chosen people, and our God has seemingly rejected them, like the Egyptians and Canaanites before them. So even though they were still legally free, they were deeply wounded spiritually, with their pride being hurt the most. The source of the most poignant grief on the part of the pious devotees of Yahweh was the ridicule cast by the idolaters upon their religion, their God, and his power. For as the pagans could not trace the downfall of the people to its true cause, the sins of the people themselves, they beheld in the fall of Jerusalem and its temple a proof of the weakness of Israel's God. Now it should be remembered or known that in ancient times it was believed that one's God served as the chief mascot and champion of their people, so that during war times it was seen as a chance to show whose God was stronger. So the fact that Israel lost the war to Babylon and to Assyria implied to ancient people that God, the God of the Hebrews, was not in fact the strongest God, and which is why the Israelites would have experienced a crisis of faith and wondering if staying true to the God of Israel was still the right decision. Indeed, as a conquered and humiliated people, some must have wondered if Israelite identity was something worth holding on to anymore. Many indeed chose to assimilate into their Babylonian surroundings, giving up on the project that God has called them to pursue. Most of these indifferent persons were lost to their people, for in their anxiety to retain the wealth they had acquired, they learned to conform to the manners and customs of the country, thus sacrificing not only their national but also their religious independence and individuality. Hence the denunciation by the prophets of the various forms of idolatry practiced among the people. Though some gave up their unique calling, it is also perhaps when one can no longer take their identity for granted that one truly begins to meaningfully search for it. Among liminal communities, the fact that the center does not institutionally nurture or support their marginalized identities causes them to transcend centralist institutions so as to create a new space unto itself. By rejecting the status quo structures, they free themselves to creatively define themselves on their own terms, thus allowing them to become something new. So that, in other words, if one can no longer depend on institutions to define oneself, to give oneself structure and a sense of meaning, then they have to do these things on their own, outside of and without these institutions. So now that the temple and the temple cult of Jerusalem was destroyed through the sacking of Jerusalem in the 500s BC, the quest of defining what is Jewish religion now fell directly upon the lay people themselves, apart from the priestly class that they used to be dependent on, thus allowing them to rediscover, if not reinvent, what it now meant to be Jewish. Facing the possible extinction of their culture and identity, some Israelites sought to dig down and rediscover the ways of their ancestors, which primarily expressed itself religiously, even though linguistically and culturally they would become rather accommodating to the host country. Although they lost the structure of their institutionalized religion, like the temple, they were, however, set free to rediscover the spiritual essence of what it means to be God's people in a way that is not dependent on such structures. However, daring to hold on to difference can cause backlash. The kind of immigrant that people seem to dislike the most are those that resist full assimilation. And among the Israelites, these were the ones who still gathered about the few prophets who remained faithful to the Lord, but whose voice and influence were lost amid the general depravity, and who, in addition to the pain caused by base ingratitude and faithlessness toward the God of their fathers, were also compelled to endure all the shafts of scorn and ridicule. So, in other words, by choosing to remain faithful to the God of Israel, these few faithful Jews outed themselves as an object of scorn, since it seemed irrational, if not illogical, to hold on to worshiping a losing God. Although these individuals would experience religious marginalization and rejection by the mainstream, just as the shepherd archetype is always rejected by the conformist farmer, these Israelites will become the founders of traditional Jewish identity as we know it today, so that even today, Jewish identity and experience can very much be described as being a diasporic identity and experience, with the result being that the more the pious exiles felt themselves repelled by their pagan environment and their disloyal fellow Israelites, the closer became the union among themselves, and the stronger their allegiance to their prophets and the law. This would be expressed in the synagogue, the heart of Jewish diasporic communities. Just as current immigrant communities maintain a sense of common identity and communal life through places of worship, so did the Jews of Babylon. In order to ensure Jewish communal life at the synagogue, the Sabbath received newfound importance as a day of rest from the affairs of the world, so that communal life with God and neighbor can be brought to the forefront. Arthur Duker notes how around this time the life of the Jew in Babylon became more centered in worship and Sabbath day gatherings and the reading of the law. The people were centering their whole life around Yahweh, and Yahweh was once again the leader of their nation. As the people continued to meet on the Sabbath to hear of Yahweh and his law, a new institution slowly began to be formed. And this institution was that of the synagogue. Previously, in Israel, before the captivity in Babylon, worship of God was centered around temple sacrifices. But again, now that the temple was destroyed, the sacrifices could no longer be performed. A new alternative way of expressing Jewish worship and community had to be developed, and this became the institution of the synagogue, where worship was no longer expressed through temple sacrifice, but by reading and studying the law and the teachings of God. Not only was the synagogue a place of worship, it was also functionally a cultural center, where Jews could learn about their history, their Hebrew language, and what it means to be Jewish. In the synagogue, the people gathered to study and to be instructed in the law. It really was a school for adults in which they would meet everywhere, on the same day and at the same time, to study the same law. Also, similar to immigrant churches today, it was also a place where Jews could express cultural autonomy by having positions and opportunities of leadership that may not be possible in other areas of their lives. The first scribes were priests like Ezekiel. As the life of the Jew became narrowed down to religion, this came to be a function of laymen as well as priests. And so the synagogue offered an opportunity for the layman to express himself in religion. Indeed, remember, under the temple organization, under the temple institution, it was priests who were the leaders of institutionalized religion. But again, now that the temple was destroyed and priests could no longer function in their traditional role, the leaders of Jewish religious life were now open to the way of regular laymen, since expressing oneself in Jewish religion was no longer contingent on providing for sacrifices, but now was expressed through study of Scripture. As Jews struggled to rediscover their identity, practices like circumcision, which together with the observance of the Sabbath, constituted a distinguishing mark of Israel, as well as regular prayer performed with the face turned toward Jerusalem, and fasting. There was also a renewed interest in discerning what was clean and unclean, which functioned to create a sense of difference and separateness from their Babylonian neighbors. Indeed, to many modern people, the laws that we find in the Torah discerning what is clean and what is unclean seem foreign and alien to us, since we do not seem to understand their logic or importance to the people of the time. But in many cases, for example, the dietary laws of not eating pork and shellfish and so forth, the logic seems to be in creating distinctions to create otherness and separateness for its own sake. Indeed, by creating parameters or fences to hem people in to create boundaries, this creates a solid sense of community, of what signifies belonging and what does not signify belonging, so as to create this internal sense of group cohesion and solidarity with each other. Duker points out how Ezekiel was very concerned with the whole system of the clean and unclean. This not only applied to animals and to the temple, but also to the entire religious life of the people and to the people themselves. It was during the exile that the rite of circumcision is brought to the fore once again, and emphasized especially for the purpose of setting the Jew apart from the heathen people around them. The rite of circumcision became so important that the Jew who neglected this rite soon found himself being regarded with scorn and contempt by his fellow Jew. So again, we see how the system of the clean and the unclean, of religious rites like circumcision, the whole point of these things was to set the Jew apart, to make them different and unique compared to the pagan peoples around them. Because a part of the reason why Israel became so wayward was understood as being too influenced by the pagan peoples around them. So to create these structural, cultural barriers to keep them different from the pagan peoples around them, this was meant to preserve their Jewish identity from being assimilated into the pagan religions and cultures. Already, we can see the seeds of the early Pharisaic movement beginning to take root, as finding God and self was beginning to be practiced through religious customs and ritual. Now, this in itself is not problematic, but the quest to find identity through law observance would become so later on. But with these religious practices, there also came an awakening of moral consciousness. Instead of ritual sacrifice, it was accepted that the submission of the personal will to that of the Lord would prove the most acceptable sacrifice in His sight. The prophet Ezekiel also establishes the new principle that the essence of religion must be sought in individual morality. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. Additionally, in the absence of religious structure centered around the temple, a kind of centralism, the Jews in their liminality on the margins of Babylonian society were able to rediscover the experience of communitas as being the true goal of God's people. George Barton observes that Jeremiah had under its shadow grasped the great truth that religion is inward in character, that it is a matter of the heart, and that no outward temple or ritual is necessary to its maintenance. In the future, God's covenant with His people was to be a covenant of the heart, not an outward covenant of stones and ceremonies. So in other words, now that all of the distractions of the temple cult and its sacrifices have been removed, the Jews were now being refined to ask, without all these other fancy distractions, without all the smoke and mirrors, what is actually essential? What still remains as being the most important thing? And for the Jews, they discovered that the most important thing to God was love. Take away everything else. Skim everything else away. Love was the most essential thing that remained. Indeed, true religion was a matter of the heart, expressed in right relationship with God and with one's neighbor through agape love, the stuff that true community is built on. But not only was communitas to be experienced among Jews, but among all peoples, along and with the Jews. According to Barton, the so-called Deutero-Isaiah believed that Yahweh would welcome the coming of the heathen to himself, but he went beyond Jeremiah, and believing that God had chosen Israel to be his missionary. She, Israel, had been conceited, thinking that she was chosen for her superior worth. Her real choice was that through knowledge of God and through suffering, she might win the world to him. In other words, previously, the Jews believed that God's mission was all about them. They believed that God selected Israel for the purpose of glorifying Israel. But they're now becoming to realize that their being chosen by God wasn't about them, but about God's purpose for them, in terms of being God's face to the world, so as being the means through which God will reconcile the whole world back unto God's self. Another way of seeing it is that Israel's pride in being a chosen people was wasted through past smugness and ethnocentrism. What the exile did was to break down this pride by removing Israel's elite to learn humility among foreign communities, so as to make them relearn the true meaning of community and relationship between people groups and within one's own group. God is a God that desires the reconciliation of the whole world unto God's self. And if Israel was not willing to bring the foreigner into the inside of the circle, then God will bring Israel into the circle of the foreigner. By recognizing that God can be experienced even within a foreign land among foreigners, broke down centralist assumptions that God was only present among and concerned with Israel. Duker states how Israel proclaimed that Yahweh had not remained in Palestine, but that he had come to Babylon, and that he was with his people. Even more important was the fact that Yahweh was to be God of all nations, and that the day would come when every knee would bow before him and call him Lord. In Babylon, the Jews realized that God was truly present among all peoples, among all nations, and that all people are called to be in fellowship and relationship with God. Barton observes how Jeremiah's conception of the attitude of Yahweh toward the Gentile nations was much in advance of that of Isaiah. Isaiah had represented Assyria as existing simply as a rod with which Yahweh could chastise Israel. The thought underlying this was that God loves Israel only, and that all other nations existed only for her benefit. Jeremiah, on the other hand, pictures a time when all nations shall awaken to the fact that their gods are vanities and lies, and shall come with confession to Yahweh, and shall be welcomed by him. This, then, is what finally solidified monotheism as we know it within the minds of the Jews. All of the gods of the Gentiles are illusions or shadows of the one truth. There has always been only one God, behind the universe which all people have various degrees of knowledge of, but who has been revealed in the fullest extent to Israel through its experiences of marginalized liminality. When the Jews did eventually return to Israel, they came back a changed people, impacted by a new self-awareness concerning their identity and unique place within the world. They soon went about rebuilding their nation under Ezra and Nehemiah, but not without controversy. Not too long after their return to Israel, Ezra and Nehemiah became dismayed to discover that some Jews had married non-Jews, which to them may have threatened the whole Jewish identity movement that they were trying to lead. Ruiz observes that here Nehemiah regards the inability of a significant number of the children of such mixed marriages to speak Yehudite to be a dangerous symptom of assimilation, underscoring the important links between language and group identity. When religion and national culture are also integrally related as they were for Judaism at this time, a knowledge of the community's language was indispensable. Indeed, it was one of the factors that distinguished and sustained the community itself. So when the exiles returned to Israel and found many of the people there no longer being able to speak Hebrew because of being born to mixed marriages that would cause them to be assimilated towards their non-Jewish half, the exiles saw this as a threat to the existence of Jewish identity within the homeland itself, which then posed a sense of existential threat to the future of Judaism within the homeland. Mirroring the conquest of Canaan, there's once again a conflict between a returning diaspora community with a new alternative vision for the nation's future, the shepherds, and a community who never immigrated, the farmers, and therefore resist the vision of their diaspora kin. For the returnees, their time and marginalized liminality made them passionate about rediscovering and re-solidifying their sense of Jewish identity and heritage, an experience that was not shared by those who remained at home. So when Ezra and Nehemiah returned to find that half of the children born to interethnic marriages could no longer speak Hebrew, they feared that the loss of the Judean language among the children among the Yehudites would lead to the dissipation of distinctively Yehudite identity in the very next generation. Yet the vehemence of his response to the practice of intermarriage suggests that much more was at stake. The more at stake was not only the loss and weakening of community identity and solidarity, but also the loss of communal sovereignty, as intermarriage opened the way to foreign influence and manipulation that may compromise Israel's mission. The last thing that the returnees wanted was to lose their newfound identity and purpose after just rediscovering it in exile. However, the downside of this quest for identity is that it can lead to inflexibility and self-ghettoization, which risks dangerous social and political isolation, which is the exact opposite of God's desired state of communitas. However, within the period of the exile, it is possible that the Book of Ruth became popular as a means of counterweighing against possible growth towards Jewish ethnocentrism during this time. In other words, given how interethnic marriage was seen as an existential threat to preserving the cultural continuation of Judaism, there exists the possibility of developing a racist sentiments within Judaism that was ethnocentric and xenophobic. Thus, to prevent that extreme, the Book of Ruth became a popular means of counterbalancing against that possible trend, that possible direction. Although its author is unknown, the biblical scholar Yair Zakovich states that it was written probably in the Second Temple period, where there was opposition to marriage by Jews with foreign women, particularly Ammonites and Moabites. Nehemiah 13:1 cites Deuteronomy 23:4 as the basis for its demand to exclude all foreigners from Israel. Our book voices an alternative view. Its heroine is an ideal Moabite woman. Although the story is romanticized in modern interpretations, the original point of the story was to make a point about inclusivity, that faith and right relationship was more important to God than ethnic or cultural heritage. This highly skilled narrative should be understood in its historical context, within the debates of the Second Temple period concerning intermarriage. The stance of Ruth is clear and unambiguous. Chesed, kindness and loyalty, are more important than ethnicity. In her look at the Book of Ruth, Gale observed that juxtaposed to the more positive readings of the book, as an enchanting bucolic story about female empowerment and romantic heterosexual love, are others that see a more ambiguous and unsettling narrative. This is because when Ruth's heroism is based solely on her virtue, then what is happening is that Ruth could be used propagandistically as a model minority. In essence, Israel is open only to the Moabite who is exceptionally virtuous, to Ruth, but not to Orpah. She thus reveals what a virtuous foreigner can teach the nation, as Ruth the Moabite teaches Judeans the meaning of Hesed, as Asian Americans educate others on how to be good minorities who know their place in a white society. In other words, Ruth is accepted by Israelite society because she knows her place in being the submissive foreigner. And we will see how that plays out in the story of Ruth. This is because Ruth can be interpreted as being an exploited character who is used by both Naomi and Boaz. Boaz knows good foreign help when he sees it, and his so-called generosity can be read as offering inducements to keep Ruth's productiveness for his own benefit. Although Boaz does not acquire economic capital from Ruth's labor, he certainly reaps much social capital and prestige in the Israelite community as a benefactor of widows. Meanwhile, Naomi too lives off the labor of Ruth the foreigner, whose actions she directs, urging Ruth to continue the nonstop work of gleaning, instructing her to make herself attractive to seduce a man in the middle of the night, and ultimately taking Ruth's child as her own. So in other words, we can see that Ruth is possibly being taken advantage of by the people around her. Boaz is potentially using her as a means of increasing his own honor and reputation as a righteous person in the community. Meanwhile, Naomi is possibly using her to live off of the fruit of her labors and using her as a means of getting a grandchild for her own legacy. Indeed, Ruth continually plays the role of the faithfully submissive foreigner to the more dominant Israelite characters who direct her. Interestingly enough, however, it is perhaps Ruth's vulnerable position as a foreign migrant that may be the main point after all, because Ruth showed herself to be an Israelite in spirit, not just through her Hesed, but because she literally lived her own Habiru experience, her own version of marginalization, of slavery in Egypt, that demonstrated her true belonging to God's people. This is because the overall theme that Jews were supposed to learn from Ruth was to simply remember what God had told them to remember in the law, that they should welcome the oppressed foreigner because their own origins as God's called people began with them as oppressed foreigners. God's call was not based on their being more worthy than any other nation. They were called because God wanted to heal the marginalized through the marginalized. Until they remember that this is what being God's people is truly about, then they will never produce the communitas that God has long desired. This then gives us a new perspective on Boaz as well, because it is interesting to note in Matthew's genealogy centuries later that it is recorded that Boaz's mother was Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute from Jericho. You can read that in Matthew 1:5. This meant that Boaz's sympathy for the foreign woman Ruth may actually be based on his own mother being a foreign woman. Thus, Boaz was not just seeing the face of a migrant, but the face of someone who reflected the experiences of his own familial story and heritage. It is the Hebrew experience of alienation and marginalization that bonded the people of God, the Hebrews, into a community in Egypt, so that regardless of ethnic origin, they left as a newly born nation composed of a mixed multitude of people that evidently was not just limited to Canaanites, but oppressed people of Egyptian and Ethiopian heritage as well, which you can read in Leviticus 24:10 and Numbers 12:1. So when they see other oppressed and marginalized individuals and communities, they are called to therefore see them as being reflections of themselves and relate to them accordingly. Ruth's origin as a Moabite, who was technically barred from entry through the law, rightly accents this point, because in the end, a marginalized person in need remains a person in need, even when they may be identified with one's enemies, because what God truly desires from God's people are acts of mercy, not sacrifice, as we read in Hosea 6:6. However, when the Jews returned to Israel, the reconciliation that is to be desired between the two communities was understood as the shepherds coming to reform the mindsets of the farmers, similar to how the Hebrews saw themselves as being a reformative force during the conquest of Canaan. With this being the case, then, reconciliation can only happen insofar as the farmers allow themselves to become reformed by the shepherds. But in both cases, the ability to reform during the conquest of Canaan and then later during the return of the exiles was met with limited degrees of success, mostly because the Israelites at the time were only armed with the law and lacked theologically what Christians can call the gospel, or the good news of reconciliation of all people. Indeed, the separateness that the law required still sometimes posed as a stumbling block to that reconciliation with all people. Ruiz notes how Ezra 4:4 identifies the returnees as people of Judah, Am Yehuda, and this identification stands in marked contrast to the designation of their opponents in disparaging terms as people of the land, or Am Ha'aretz. This designation, as Gale points out, was deployed as part of the strategy by which the immigrants established ideological distance between themselves and the members of the Judean population who had not been taken into exile. With the irony being is that we see this same pattern play out today when the Jewish immigrants who came back from Europe and the Middle East, who returned to Israel, again saw themselves as being a completely different people from the Palestinians who never left Israel, who themselves are the descendants of the Jews who never experienced exile into the diaspora. Although God desired reconciliation and communitas, this could not be truly achieved until something changed concerning what the law deemed clean and unclean. Until then, Israel would have to wait for a Messiah to deliver them into the true kingdom of God. So in the next section, we will read how the coming of Jesus came to fulfill the need of God using Israel to be that force of universal reconciliation with all people back unto God's self. And we will read how the experience of Paul put that call to reconciliation with all people to the forefront, as Paul will now wrestle with his own past Jewish ethnocentrism and nationalism to become an apostle for the foreigner, an apostle to the Gentile. So that's what we will see in the next section of this series.